on earth do you mean I wasn't included in the will?
The room was too quiet for a family that had just inherited millions of dollars. Rain tapped softly against the tall office windows while Arthur Levin adjusted his glasses and continued reading from the final page of Charles Mercer's will. Rebecca Mercer sat near the corner of the table with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Michael stared at the carpet, bouncing his knee anxiously, and directly across from Arthur. Daniel waited. Still, calm, certain. Arthur cleared his throat. The lake property in Vermont shall transfer fully to Rebecca Mercer. Rebecca nodded once without emotion. Arthur continued. The investment portfolio and associated trust accounts shall transfer to Michael Mercer. Michael exhaled shakily. Then Arthur stopped speaking. Daniel waited for the next sentence. It never came. Arthur slowly closed the folder. For a moment, nobody moved. Daniel frowned slightly. I think you skipped something. Arthur didn't answer immediately. The hesitation lasted just long enough to change the temperature inside the room. Arthur finally looked up. No, Daniel. I didn't. The words landed softly, but the silence afterward felt violent. Daniel blinked once. His expression barely changed, but confusion quietly entered his face. That's everything? Arthur nodded carefully. Rebecca stared toward the window. Michael looked genuinely unsettled now. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. That doesn't make sense. Nobody disagreed with him. That was the disturbing part. The narrator's voice settled calmly over the tension. Sometimes inheritance reveals far more than money. Sometimes the reading of a will becomes the final conversation a family never had while someone was alive. And sometimes, the silence inside the room says more than the document itself. Daniel Mercer had spent nearly 30 years helping run his father's business. Everyone in that office had assumed he would inherit most of the estate, including Daniel himself, which was why Arthur Levin's hesitation felt less like confusion and more like fear. Before we go further, if you've been following stories like this on Chaos of Lives, let us know where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, take a moment to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Arthur opened the folder again. There was an amendment made 3 months ago. Daniel's eyes lifted slowly. 3 months earlier, Charles Mercer had suddenly stopped returning his calls, stopped inviting him to the house, stopped speaking to him entirely. Daniel swallowed carefully. And what exactly did the amendment change? Arthur's voice lowered. It removed your name from the will. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. Michael looked at his sister immediately. Daniel noticed that. And suddenly, the room no longer felt shocked. It felt prepared. Daniel stood slowly from the chair. Did he explain why? Arthur looked down at the papers. No. Too fast. Too controlled. Daniel watched him carefully. Arthur Levin had represented the Mercer family for over 40 years. He was not a man easily shaken, but his hands looked unusually stiff against the folder. Daniel noticed that too. Rebecca suddenly stood. Dad made his decision. Her tone came out sharper than intended. Michael frowned. Rebecca. But she kept going. You weren't entitled to everything just because you worked with him. Daniel turned toward her slowly. This isn't about everything. Rebecca looked away first, which made Daniel even more uncomfortable, because it sounded like she'd been waiting for this conversation long before today. Later that evening, rainwater dripped from the concrete ceiling of the underground garage as Arthur hurried toward his car. Daniel followed him. Arthur. The older man stopped walking but didn't turn around immediately. Daniel stepped closer. You know something? Arthur finally faced him. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then quietly, your father became afraid near the end. Daniel stared at him. Afraid of what? Arthur looked exhausted suddenly. I don't think he knew anymore. Arthur entered his car and locked the doors before Daniel could ask another question. That night, Daniel entered his father's mansion using the old security code. The house felt frozen in time. Half-finished tea still sat inside the kitchen. A folded blanket rested across Charles's favorite chair. The silence inside the mansion felt heavier than grief. Daniel walked toward the office at the far end of the hallway, then stopped. One section of the room looked wrong. A large cabinet near the wall had been removed recently. Fresh marks remained across the hardwood floor. Something had been taken, and someone had removed it before the funeral. Daniel slowly looked around the empty office. For the first time, he felt like a stranger inside his own father's house. Years earlier, Daniel Mercer had become the reliable son long before anyone asked him to. When Charles expanded his real estate company, Daniel stayed late. When Charles traveled, Daniel handled negotiations. When Charles grew older, Daniel quietly absorbed responsibilities nobody else wanted. People around the family called him the Golden Son. But inside the Mercer house, love rarely sounded warm. Charles rewarded loyalty. He didn't express affection. And Daniel had spent most of his adult life mistaking responsibility for closeness. At family gatherings, Rebecca often watched silently while Charles discussed business only with Daniel. Michael usually arrived late, sometimes drunk, sometimes asking for loans. But Daniel always sat beside their father. Always. Rebecca remembered those dinners differently than Daniel did. To her, Charles never looked proud, only dependent. And over time, dependency began turning into resentment. Meanwhile, Michael sat inside a dim sports bar, staring at unpaid notices spread across the table. His hands trembled slightly. A man across from him leaned closer. "You told me the inheritance was coming." Michael rubbed his face hard. "It is." But even he no longer sounded convinced. The following morning, Daniel visited St. Catherine's Hospice Center. Clara Bennett sat near the reception desk organizing paperwork when he approached her. The moment he introduced himself, her expression changed. Not shock. Recognition. "You're Daniel Mercer." It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded slowly. Clara suddenly looked uncomfortable, like she had already heard his name too many times. Inside a quiet cafeteria near the hospice garden, Clara stirred her coffee carefully. "Your father talked a lot near the end," she said softly. Daniel waited. Clara hesitated, mostly to himself. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What did he say?" Clara looked toward the window, then finally answered. "He kept asking whether blood can lie." Daniel stared at her. The sentence settled into the air slowly, unnaturally, like something unfinished. Weeks before Charles died, the Mercer family sat around the dining table inside the mansion. Wine glasses, soft jazz, forced politeness. Then suddenly, Charles asked a strange question. "Do children always belong to the men who raise them?" Rebecca froze instantly. Michael laughed awkwardly. Daniel frowned. What kind of question is that? But Charles never answered. He only stared quietly at Daniel across the table. Now, remembering it, Daniel felt cold. Back inside the office later that afternoon, Daniel searched through old desk drawers. Most were empty, until he found one locked compartment partially open. Inside sat a sealed envelope. His father's handwriting covered the front. Private. Daniel slowly opened it. Inside were old photographs, medical paperwork, and a DNA testing receipt dated 6 months earlier. Daniel's breathing slowed, because suddenly, Arthur's fear made sense, at least partially, and somewhere inside the mansion, a floorboard creaked softly. Daniel turned sharply toward the hallway outside the office. Silence. The mansion settled quietly around him. Old wood, distant rain, the low hum of the refrigerator somewhere downstairs. For a moment, he considered calling out. Instead, he slipped the envelope beneath his coat and walked carefully into the corridor. Nobody was there, but near the staircase, fresh mud stained the marble floor. Someone else had been inside the house recently, and they hadn't wanted to be seen. Later that evening, Daniel sat alone in his apartment kitchen with the DNA receipt spread across the counter beside him. The testing had been ordered exactly 6 months earlier, 1 week after Charles had been hospitalized for chest pain. Daniel stared at the date repeatedly. His father had been 82 years old. Why would a man that age suddenly begin questioning paternity? Unless something had happened, or someone had told him something. Daniel looked again at the photographs from the envelope. Most showed ordinary family moments. Vacations, birthdays, graduations. But one photograph was missing. A rectangular faded space remained inside the envelope where another picture had once been stored. Someone had removed it recently. Meanwhile, Rebecca sat inside her dark living room staring through the curtains as headlights passed outside. Her phone rested in her lap. 3 missed calls from Daniel. 1 from Michael. She ignored all of them, then finally dialed Michael herself. The moment he answered, she whispered, "Did he go back to the house?" Michael sounded confused. "How would I know?" Rebecca closed her eyes tightly. "He's looking now." Michael sat upright immediately. Looking for what? But Rebecca had already ended the call. The following morning, Daniel arrived unannounced at Arthur Levin's office. Arthur looked tired before Daniel even spoke. Daniel placed the DNA receipt on the desk. Arthur's face changed instantly. Not surprise. Recognition. "You knew?" Arthur removed his glasses slowly. "Your father hired the test privately." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And after the results came back, he changed the will." Arthur stayed silent. That silence answered more than words could. Daniel stepped closer to the desk. "You told me he became afraid." Arthur nodded faintly. "He received medical information that changed him." Daniel stared hard at him. "What medical information?" Arthur looked away. "The kind that makes a man question his entire life." The room fell quiet again, and for the first time, Daniel felt anger beginning to overpower grief. That afternoon, Daniel met Clara Bennett inside a small roadside diner outside town. Rain pressed softly against the windows while old country music played overhead. Clara looked exhausted before the conversation even began. "He stopped sleeping near the end," she admitted. "Your father would sit awake all night looking through old photographs." Daniel listened carefully. "Sometimes he cried," she continued quietly. "Sometimes he just stared at the wall for hours." Daniel lowered his eyes. He had never once seen his father cry. Not at funerals. Not at hospitals. Not even when Daniel's mother died. Which made this version of Charles Mercer feel unfamiliar and frightening. Clara suddenly paused. There was one picture he carried constantly. Daniel looked up immediately. "What picture?" "A photograph of your mother at a lake house. You were standing beside her." Daniel's stomach tightened. "That photo's missing now." Clara nodded slowly. "Your father said it proved something." Daniel froze. "Proved what?" But Clara looked genuinely shaken now. "I don't think he ever fully explained it to himself." That night, Michael arrived drunk at Daniel's apartment. Not heavily drunk, just emotionally loose enough to stop hiding things. "You need to stop chasing this," he muttered while pacing the kitchen. Daniel folded his arms. Rebecca knew about the amendment before the funeral. Michael stopped pacing. Then quietly, "She searched Dad's office the night he died." Daniel stared at him. "She said she was looking for financial papers." Michael swallowed hard. "But I think she was looking for something else." Across town, Daniel drove directly to Rebecca's house. Rain hammered against the windshield the entire way. Rebecca opened the door, but immediately regretted it. Daniel saw it in her face. "You knew," he said calmly. Rebecca stepped back slowly. "I knew he changed the will." "That's not what I asked." Rebecca crossed her arms tightly. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel quietly asked, "What did Dad find?" Rebecca's eyes watered instantly. Not from sadness. From panic. Rebecca turned away from him. "You think this family was normal?" Daniel's voice hardened. "Answer the question." Rebecca laughed once under her breath. A broken laugh. "You were always his favorite." Daniel shook his head slowly. "He cut me out of the will." But Rebecca finally snapped. "You still don't understand." She turned toward him sharply now. "You weren't even supposed to know." The words escaped before she could stop them. Silence crashed into the room immediately afterward. Daniel stared at her. Rebecca covered her mouth. Too late. The following morning, Daniel sat inside St. Catherine's Medical Archive room reviewing old family records connected to his mother's final illness. A clerk quietly handed him photocopies from decades earlier. Daniel scanned the paperwork slowly, then stopped. Blood type records. His mother. O positive. Charles Mercer. O negative. Daniel. AB positive. He stared at the page for several long seconds. Even without medical expertise, he knew something felt wrong. The room suddenly felt too small. Later that afternoon, Daniel confronted Arthur one final time. This time, Arthur didn't try avoiding him. The older man looked emotionally exhausted. Your father believed you weren't his biological son. Daniel said nothing. Arthur continued carefully. He discovered inconsistencies after reviewing old hospital files. Daniel's voice came out hollow. And the DNA test. Arthur hesitated again. That hesitation said enough. Daniel looked away slowly. Everything around him suddenly felt rearranged. Not physically, emotionally. Every memory now carried a second meaning. That night, Daniel sat alone in darkness inside his apartment. No television, no music, only silence. And slowly, old memories began resurfacing differently. His father correcting him too harshly at baseball games. Long silences during car rides. The strange distance that always existed beneath their relationship. Back then, Daniel believed Charles simply struggled emotionally. Now, every moment felt infected with suspicion. And somewhere deep inside himself, another fear quietly emerged. What if Charles had known longer than anyone realized? Meanwhile, Rebecca sat alone in her kitchen, drinking whiskey directly from a glass tumbler. Michael stood near the doorway, watching her carefully. She told him before she died, Rebecca whispered. Michael frowned. Mom. Rebecca nodded weakly. She confessed the affair. Michael's face drained completely. Rebecca wiped tears angrily from her cheeks. Dad spent decades believing the lie. Michael sat down slowly. When did he find out? Rebecca stared blankly ahead. 6 months ago. And suddenly, everything about Charles Mercer's final months began making terrible sense. Michael looked toward his sister carefully. Does Daniel know who his real father is? Rebecca shook her head slowly. No. Silence settled heavily between them. Then Michael asked the question neither of them wanted answered. Did Dad still love him? Rebecca closed her eyes. That was the worst part. Michael frowned slightly. What do you mean? Rebecca looked down into her glass. He did. The following morning, Arthur Levin called Daniel and asked him to come alone. No explanations. Just an address and a time. By noon, Daniel sat across from him inside the same office where the will had first been read. But the atmosphere felt different now. Heavier. Arthur opened a locked desk drawer and removed a small cassette tape sealed inside a plastic evidence sleeve. Daniel frowned. What is that? Arthur placed it gently on the table. Your father recorded this 4 days before he died. Daniel didn't move. Arthur's voice lowered. He instructed me to give it to you only if the truth came out. The room became completely silent. Even Arthur looked uncomfortable touching it. Minutes later, Daniel sat alone inside Arthur's private conference room while the old cassette recorder hissed softly. Then came his father's voice. Weak, tired, unsteady in a way Daniel had never heard before. If you're listening to this. A long pause followed. Then I probably failed to fix what I broke. Daniel lowered his eyes slowly. On the tape, Charles coughed hard before continuing. I spent 50 years loving someone who wasn't mine. Daniel's breathing stopped. And hating myself for still loving him anyway. The words didn't sound angry. That was what made them devastating. They sounded exhausted. Charles continued speaking through static. I tried to remove you from my heart after I learned the truth. Another pause. But every time I looked at you, I still saw my son. Daniel covered his mouth suddenly. Emotion hit him without warning now. Not rage. Not confusion. Grief. Raw and humiliating grief. Because for the first time in his life, his father sounded emotionally human. And it happened only after death. On the tape, Charles admitted something else. The inheritance had never been about punishment. It had been about emotional survival. I thought if I removed your name, Charles whispered weakly, maybe the betrayal would stop following me. Daniel stared blankly ahead. The room blurred slightly around him. His father hadn't removed him because he stopped loving him. He removed him because he couldn't survive the contradiction anymore. Love beside betrayal. Fatherhood beside doubt. Decades beside a lie. Later that afternoon, Daniel stepped outside Arthur's building into cold gray weather. Cars passed. People moved normally down the sidewalk. But Daniel stood completely still. For years, he had believed money represented value inside the Mercer family. Now he understood something worse. Charles had loved him deeply enough to suffer. And somehow, that hurt more than being removed from the will. Across the street, Rebecca stepped out of a taxi and saw Daniel standing alone. She immediately recognized the expression on his face. He had heard the tape. Slowly, she approached him. Daniel didn't look at her when he spoke. You knew? Rebecca swallowed carefully. I knew he was falling apart. Daniel finally turned toward her. Mom told you before she died. Rebecca nodded once. Tears filled her eyes almost immediately. She made me promise not to destroy the family. Daniel laughed softly under his breath. A tired laugh. The family was already destroyed. Rain began falling lightly again. Rebecca stepped closer. You think this was easy for me? Daniel's voice stayed frighteningly calm. You watched him erase me. Rebecca shook her head quickly. No. I watched him destroy himself. Daniel finally looked directly into her eyes. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Rebecca whispered, he still loved you more than anyone. Daniel looked away immediately, because somehow, that sentence hurt worse than everything else. That night, Daniel sat awake replaying memories from the funeral visitation days earlier. At the time, Charles's final expression inside the casket had looked peaceful. Now Daniel remembered something else. Before the casket had been closed, Daniel had stood beside his father alone for several seconds. And even then, Charles's final weeks had already changed his face completely. Not anger, not hatred, just exhaustion, as if carrying the truth had aged him faster than illness itself. The following morning, Daniel returned to the mansion one final time. The house felt emptier now, not because Charles was gone, because the illusion surrounding the family had collapsed. Daniel stood inside the office staring at the empty space where the cabinet once stood, then quietly asked the question nobody had answered yet. If he still loved me. His voice almost disappeared. Why erase me? No one responded. Only silence filled the room again. And for the first time, Daniel realized silence had always been the Mercer family's real inheritance. Later that afternoon, Clara Bennett arrived unexpectedly at the mansion carrying a small leather folder. Daniel invited her inside quietly. She looked around the empty house with visible sadness. Your father asked me to keep something, she explained softly. Daniel's chest tightened immediately. Clara placed the folder carefully onto the dining table. He changed his mind near the end. Daniel stared at her. What do you mean? Clara hesitated. 3 days before his stroke, he asked Arthur to prepare another amendment. Daniel froze completely. Clara sat quietly while rain tapped against the windows behind them. He wanted to restore your name. Daniel looked down slowly. Clara continued carefully. But the stroke happened before he could sign the papers. The room became painfully quiet. Everything suddenly felt unfinished. Not just legally, emotionally. Charles Mercer had died somewhere between anger and forgiveness. And now nobody could fully separate the two. Inside the leather folder sat a handwritten letter folded neatly in half. Daniel recognized his father's handwriting immediately. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The letter was short. Painfully short. You were never the lie. Daniel's breathing slowed. What happened around you was. He stopped reading for several seconds. Then continued. I wanted time to forgive your mother before I forgave myself. Daniel lowered the paper slowly. Because suddenly, his father no longer felt cruel. Just broken. Meanwhile, Michael met privately with Arthur Levin later that week. Arthur reviewed financial transfer paperwork quietly. But Michael interrupted him halfway through. I don't want it. Arthur looked up slowly. Michael rubbed both hands across his face. That money ruined all of us before Dad even died. Arthur studied him carefully. For once, Michael sounded sober emotionally. Not financially desperate. Not reckless. Just tired. Across town, Rebecca wandered silently through the empty Mercer mansion days later. Most furniture had already been removed. Family photographs sat stacked inside cardboard boxes. The house echoed now. Rebecca stopped beside the dining room table where decades of carefully controlled conversations had once happened. And finally, she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly enough to reveal how long she'd been holding it back. Because protecting the family secret had never protected the family at all. It only delayed the collapse. Weeks later, Daniel stood alone at Charles Mercer's grave beneath cold autumn skies. No relatives. No flowers from the family. Only silence. He placed the unsigned letter beside the headstone carefully. Wind moved softly through the cemetery trees, while Daniel stared at his father's name carved into stone. For years, he had spent his life trying to earn Charles Mercer's approval. Now he understood something tragic. His father had loved him the entire time, and still wasn't emotionally strong enough to survive the truth surrounding him. The narrator's voice returned calmly. Some families survive betrayal for decades, not because the truth disappears, but because everyone quietly agrees not to touch it. Inside the Mercer family, silence became tradition, and over time, that silence protected lies more carefully than it protected people. Charles Mercer died believing his family had betrayed him. Daniel Mercer survived realizing love and resentment had existed side by side his entire life. And Rebecca was left carrying the weight of a secret she once believed would save everyone. Daniel slowly walked away from the grave without looking back. The unsigned letter remained beneath the flowers, moving gently in the wind. Cold clouds drifted overhead. The cemetery fell quiet again. And despite everything that had happened, the inheritance no longer felt like the real loss. The real loss was discovering the truth too late to repair what silence had already destroyed. If this story made you think, you can check the screen now and watch our next video, or explore more stories like this on Chaos of Lives.